Hello, I'm Richard Vobes, the Bald Explorer, and again I'm not out on another walk because, well, there is snow, there is rain, and there is sleet, so I'm not out. I'm keeping as warm as I can in my winter retreat. Today's show, I wanted to talk about Chichester Castle. Now, Martin Snow, we know Martin, he often rings me up and he says, Richard, where are you going today? And I said, oh, I haven't quite thought of anywhere. He said, why don't you go and visit the castle at Chichester? And I said, I didn't know there was a castle at Chichester. Now, I am not the fount of all knowledge by any means. People have been very kind and saying, oh, you know, you seem to know a lot of stuff. Well, the secret is and do quite a bit of research. Anyway, when he said about the castle at Chichester, I thought, that would be interesting. So off I popped, and while we were filming another film in Chichester around the Chichester ship canal, I quickly went and got some photos and some stills which I'll be playing in, because it might be useful if I don't get back and the weather turned grim, as it has. So the Chichester Castle is, well, there's not a castle as such to see now because it's long gone, but when the Normans came and invaded in 1066 and the Battle of Hastings, which we all know took place on the 14th of October, they wanted to stamp their authority on this new nation that they were interested in conquering. And conquer they did. It's funny because actually we think of it as the invasion of the Normans, don't we? The sort of Norman invasion. But actually they didn't so much invade, they just sort of changed the administration. They didn't bring swathes of Norman people over. The Thanes, the Anglo-Saxon sort of landlords and people in charge, they were all got shot of, and instead the Normans put in their barons and their landlords and their important people. So after the Battle of Hastings, they wanted very quickly to make their mark on Britain so that they could say, we're now in charge. And one of the things they did, of course, is they put up castles. And I've looked at a few of the castles in my videos. And initially, these castles were timber castles on a motte. I've got a video where I go and look at Ebberton Castle. And I know there are other castles. In fact, I believe there are 11 castles which were erected before 1100. So in that sort of 34 years, is it, that they were around, they knocked up 11 castles in Sussex. And one of those castles happened to be at Chichester, an ideal place because Chichester was a walled city or a walled town then, the Romans having come in and made it one of their cities and centres of operation, and there was a convenient wall. So in the northeast portion of Chichester, Roger de Montgomery, one of the barons that William the Conqueror had entrusted and given huge swathes of land. He'd given him land up in Shrewsbury, in Shropshire. He'd given him land in Sussex and also in Wales. So he was a very important man. He didn't actually fight in the Battle of Hastings, but he was holding fort, so to speak, back in Normandy while William went off doing his conquering and battling and killing and maiming and taking over and sticking an arrow in the eye of Harold. However, to reward all these people who'd helped, he gave them the land, and Roger Montgomery was one of those people. He became the first Earl of Shrewsbury and also the first Earl of Arundel, and one of the properties that he had and built subsequently was Arundel Castle. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here because this is much before that when Chichester had its own little castle on a motte. It was a motte and bailey castle. So a motte is a mound and the bailey is effectively the courtyard around it. Now in Chichester, if you know Chichester, you've been to Chichester, go to Priory Park because you'll find what's left of the existing motte. It is just a mound of earth that's now grassed over, and in fact there are a couple of trees out the top, but it's very pleasant. The kids can run up and down and pretend to be playing, I nearly said cowboys and Indians then, but I don't mean that at all, but they can have a run around and what have you. Now very close by is a rather interesting building called the Guildhall, and you'll notice it's a sort of flint and stone building. Anyway, So this is the area where Chichester Castle once was. Only there for about a couple of 100 years, maybe 250 years, something like that. Initially, it was, of course, a residence. The Earl of Arundel, or Roger de Montgomery, would actually reside there. It also was a point of administration, and later on it became a court, and they held prison cells inside it as well. So it was there to sort of show the authority over the Anglo-Saxons and keep order, which it did very well. And then the First Barons' War broke out. Now this was in 1215, and it's quite a complicated story, but essentially we had the evil King John on the throne. He was a despotic king who wanted to rule the way he wanted to rule, regardless of all the important landowners in the area, and he would overrule and do his thing. And the landowners weren't very happy about this, the barons, and eventually they got him to sign what is called the Magna Carta. And we all remember that being signed at Runnymede in 1215. Well, King John was still one of those kings that would have nothing to do with it. He still wanted to run his own way. He was a dreadful king. And the barons were up in arms about this because they thought that they had some sort of control over the king, and that they knew, that things are going to be okay for them and they could get on and maintain what they were doing. But no, so suddenly they decided that they were going to go to war against the king. No small thing. So in order to do that, they needed to enlist help. And the English at that time were quite pally with France. Now, we've had a very interesting relationship with France over the last 1,000 years, but at that time, the English were relatively pally with France. And as it happened, the heir apparent, Louis VIII, was very interested in becoming the King of England himself. So the barons got together with him and a French army, and they did battle with King John. Well, as a result of that, going back to Chichester, a number of the castles were captured by the French, which effectively was in the hands of the barons. And so Chichester Castle was one of those. However, this period of war went on until 1217, and at the end of it, King John, I think in 1216 actually, King John, he died from dysentery. Nobody was terribly upset that he died, and I think if you've got to go in a horrible way, then he probably deserved it. And I think nobody was too bothered that he died in such a miserable fashion. However, as he died, it left the new king, a place for the new king, so the crown then went to Henry III. Now, the barons didn't really have any problem with Henry III. In fact, most of them were on Henry III's side, and they thought, well, actually, rather than having this French king coming in, it's far better to have an English king. So they deserted Louis VIII, and got shot of him, and all got behind Henry III. And so the war effectively came to an end. And Henry III looked at Chichester Castle and said, well, do you know what? This castle, it's too easy for somebody else to sort of take it over and hold the country or the area at ransom. We'll raze it to the ground. And that's what happened. They razed it to the ground, and it took, I think, until 1221 until it was actually taken all the way down. So there would have been outbuildings and various, wooden constructions and the palisade going round and all of that, all in that Priory Park area. Well, then King Henry III, he decided he would give this land to his brother, who was Richard, King of the Romans was his title. And Richard thought, right, I want to give this land to the Franciscans. They were still amazingly religious, these kings, and of course, they were protecting the next life that was likely to happen. And so doing these good deeds and giving land and opportunity to some of the monasteries was a good thing to do. So he gave the land to the Franciscans, and the Order of the Grey Friars, as they're often known, took over. And in fact, the building now that you see, which is called the Guildhall because it changed its function later on and became a Guildhall, was much earlier than that, was part of the church of the monastery that the Grey Friars had and built around it, and lived and subsequently had a jolly old time, as I'm sure the Grey Friars did. So that's a sort of potted history of the Normans in Chichester and their castle. Now, one of the other things that I haven't mentioned is, of course, the Normans were great church builders themselves, and in Chichester is Chichester Cathedral, and lots of people go there and visit it. It's right at the centre of the town. Well, originally, the Anglo-Saxons had the cathedral in Selsey. Now, Martin Snow and I visited St Wilfrid's Church, Church Norton in Selsey, and it's that area that it is thought that that's where the original Anglo-Saxon cathedral was. But the Normans had this policy of taking cathedrals which were in out-of-the-way places into more big, larger urban places like the city of Chichester. And so it came down to Bishop Ralph Luffer to finish or manage the church building, or the cathedral building rather, of the church at Chichester, and up it went. And of course, as you go there now, it's changed over many different periods and added to, and bits, not least parts of it falling down, and then the main tower, the bell tower, which is built separately, because actually the Normans, when they built it, they put it on I didn't really think about this terribly well. They put it on some not very good ground, and as a result there was some subsidence, and one of the towers fell down. So the Normans, great builders, they were in Chichester, and I didn't know that there was a church, there was a castle in Chichester until Martin said it, and then suddenly all this history comes out. So if you get the chance, do go round and run up and down the motte. It's good fun, and it's part of the heritage. So there we go. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I'll be out on another walk when the weather bucks up a bit. Until the next time, thanks so much for watching, and goodbye.